Welcome everybody. I'm glad to present my study on oblique relative clauses in Italian high school students with developmental dyslexia, joint work with Anna Cardinaletti and Francesca Volpato. I will first illustrate our main research questions and a brief overview of the literature about dyslexia and the syntactic competence of Italian individuals with developmental dyslexia. I will present participants to our study, the tasks we used, and the results. Finally, I will draw the conclusions. We are interested in how Italian students with developmental dyslexia perform in the repetition and production of relative clauses. We expect that they face more difficulties than their typically developing peers. In particular, we aim at investigating which difficulties Italian students with dyslexia and their TD peers show in the repetition and production of the most complex relative clauses, namely genitive and prepositional relative clauses. Dyslexia is a developmental learning difficulty. In general, individuals with dyslexia face difficulties in written word decoding and reading comprehension. Recent research has shown that subjects with a diagnosis of dyslexia may also face difficulties in oral tasks of comprehension and production of complex syntactic structures. Through the administration of oral comprehension and production tasks, recent studies have investigated the syntactic competence of Italian children and students with a diagnosis of dyslexia in mastering clitic pronouns, WH questions, passive and relative clauses. Results suggest that Italian individuals with DD encounter difficulties with their structures which share one property. They are all derived by syntactic movement. It is possible that syntactic movement makes these constructions harder to be parsed by subjects with DD. 6 Italian 15-year-old high school students with a diagnosis of developmental dyslexia and a preeminent deficit in reading took part in the study as the experimental group. 12 Italian typically developing peers participated as the control group. Both groups were administered two oral tasks, a sentence repetition and an elicited production. The sentence repetition task was developed by Del Pupo and colleagues 2016 and consists of 49 stimuli, 33 experimental sentences and 16 control sentences of the same length as the experimental ones. This allows us to disentangle difficulties due to syntactic properties from difficulties due to memory deficits. A sentence repetition task is a good indicator of language ability and memory resources. Participants can repeat verbatim only words and syntactic structures which belong to their language competence. Shorter sentences are easier to repeat than longer sentences, which need coding and decoding to be present. A sentence repetition task also allows to directly control the constructions tested and to test several constructions by using one and the same task. The study of Del Pupo and colleagues 2018 showed that middle school and high school students with DD were less accurate than TD peers in the sentence repetition task. The elicited production task of oblique relative clauses was first realized by Mulas 2000, whose results are reported in Guasti and Cardinaletti 2003, in order to investigate children's ability to produce prepositional and genitive relative clauses. The test was subsequently adapted, and the updated version consists of 20 sentences with masculine singular DPs. Guasti and Cardinaletti 2003 investigated the production of oblique relative clauses by TD children and found that oblique relatives are mastered not earlier than 10 years. As data on adolescents and adults with and without DD are missing, we administered this task in order to investigate whether these constructions are mastered with increasing age and at higher levels of instruction. We first tested our participants on the repetition of left dislocation sentences, WH questions, clefts, and oblique relative clauses, specifically genitive and prepositional relatives. One example of each type of sentence is provided in the slide. Then we elicited the production of subject and object relative clauses, indirect object relatives, prepositional and genitive relative clauses. One example of each type of sentence is provided in the slide. Overall, students with ED performed significantly lower than the control peers. The box plot shows that students with ED display more variability in the distribution of their results. DD students were less accurate than their TD peers in cleft sentences, with an average of 31% versus 72%. They were also less accurate in repeating oblique relative clauses, with an average of 37% versus 78% of their TD peers. Clefts and oblique relative clauses are significantly more demanding than WH questions and left dislocation sentences for both groups. Experimental sentences show lower accuracy than the control sentences of the same length, in which the participants scored almost 100%. This means that the difficulties observed in experimental sentences are not due to limited memory resources, but to syntactic properties. Here we focus on the repetition of oblique relative clauses. The students with dyslexia were less accurate than the typically developing students in genitive relative clauses, 42% versus 79%, genitive relative clauses introduced by a preposition, which DD students did not succeed in repeating verbatim, while TD students repeated with an average of 62%, and indirect object relative clauses introduced by Quale, 46% versus 83%. As for indirect object relatives introduced by Cui, the distribution of the repetitions by DD group presents much more variability than the other structures. Students with dyslexia showed significantly more difficulties in the genitive relatives with a preposition than the other oblique relative clauses. Typically developing students did not. In this slide, we provide some examples of ungrammatical sentences that our participants produced. Looking at the genitive relative clauses, some participants said il maestro pettina la signora a cui la figlia lavora, instead of il maestro pettina la signora la cui figlia lavora, producing an ungrammatical indirect object relative in place of the genitive relative. If we look at the genitive relative clauses introduced by a preposition, the most difficult ones for the DD group, we observe that one error was to omit the preposition. The ungrammatical sentence produced was il papà guarda il bambino la cui zia piacciono I gatti, that resembles a genitive relative. As for indirect object relatives, some of our students produced a genitive relative clause introduced by a preposition, as la bambina lava il cane al cui padrone dà I biscotti, instead of la bambina lava il cane a cui il padrone dà I biscotti. Those participants are able to produce a genitive relative with a preposition, but they cannot comprehend the function of a phrase like al cui padrone. Looking at the last example, we observe the lack of agreement between the relative pronoun and its referent. Il cane morde I ragazzi, al quale singular il nonno compra un gelato, in place of il cane morde I ragazzi, ai quali il nonno compra un gelato. Let us consider the performances of our students in the elicited production of oblique relative clauses. We divided the participants' responses into three categories. Target responses, that is what we expected from them, errors, that is ungrammatical sentences, sentences of sloppy registers or incomplete productions, and correct alternatives, that is strategies that were used by participants to avoid the target constructions but equally correct as the target responses. As the two graphs show, both groups performed at ceiling in the production of subject relatives and avoided producing object relative clauses, preferring the production of passive relatives. Overall, we observe a large variability in the distribution of produced oblique relatives. Typically developing students outperformed the students with dyslexia. The TD group produced an average of 53% target oblique relatives, while the group with DD only produced an average of 14%. The group with DD produced more errors, with an average of 47%, and more correct alternatives, with an average of 39%, than the TD group, who only produced 12% of ungrammatical sentences and an average of 35% of correct alternatives. If we look at the sentence types, we can observe that genitive relatives are the most avoided sentences by both TD and DD, while they appear to be more confident with the prepositional relatives. In this slide, some examples of ungrammatical productions are provided. Some participants produced a sentence like tocca allo studente il cui professore insegna storia, which resembles a genitive relative, instead of an indirect object relative, tocca allo studente a cui il professore insegna storia. Only students with DD also produced the resumptive clitic gli, him. Some students produced the relative pronoun quale instead of cui, producing the ungrammatical sequence il quale professore. The same ungrammatical strategies were used when prepositional and relative clauses were elicited. In genitive relatives, dove, where, was used as a complementizer, maybe trying to avoid piping of the article il, the, with the relative pronoun. Some students also again used quale instead of cui, saying tocca il cucciolo il quale papà pesca un pesce. Other strategies were used by our participants to avoid the production of indirect object relatives and genitive relatives. On the one hand, the infelicitous combination of the complementizer che, that, and the clitic pronoun gli, him, in place of an indirect object relative, and the misuse of the complementizer, trying to produce a genitive relative clause. Those strategies are typical of sloppy registers and of children's productions up to 10 years of age. On the other hand, we observed two common strategies among participants, using a subject relative with verb change, tocca il maiale che riceve dal gallo un calzino pieno di dolci, where the indirect object of the target response becomes the subject of the correct alternative. Finally, instead of a genitive relative clause, two subject relatives were produced. Tocca il papà che ha il figlio che gioca a calcio. In sum, what do our results tell us about the competence of DD and TD students with complex syntactic structures, in particular oblique relative clauses? Students with DD perform accurately in the repetition of left dislocation sentences and WH questions like their TD peers, while they show more difficulties than TD students in the repetition of clefts and in both repetition and production of oblique relative clauses. In fact, DD produced more ungrammatical responses and sentences typical of sloppy registers than the TD group. However, both groups show persistent difficulties in mastering oblique relative clauses, which are typical of the formal register of Italian and present a combination of syntactic movement, complex embedding, and piping. Our results suggest that oblique relative clauses are not completely acquired by adolescents yet. Thank you for your attention.